Welcome to the Kubik Report podcast. We continue with part 2 of this historic tribute to Robin Jones, who died on May 21st, 2024. You may have already heard part 1 as we talked with Rolf Jones and his sister Danielle Feith about their father, Mr. Robin Jones. Today's podcast continues with parts of a sermon that Rolf Jones gave about his father at the West Coast Church of God on August 3rd, 2024. He titled it well, Reflections on the Life of Robin George Jones, 1935 to 2024, A Physical Connection to a Spiritual World. He continues with the story about Robin Jones, but equally interesting, he brings out the history of the Church of God in Ambassador College in the United Kingdom that many of us lived through as well. Robin Jones was one of the charter members of both church and college in the United Kingdom. Robin Jones himself visited the West Coast Church of God and gave a chronology of the church in our time on March 2nd this year. I have a link to it in the show notes with this podcast. In this podcast, we see him more in his pastoral and journalistic career. He recites the history of Ambassador College in Bricket Wood that was common to many of us. Now let's go to Rolf Jones on August 3rd, 2024.
And it is good to be here with you all here in the West Coast Church of God once again. Time passes quickly, and since last speaking with you here on March 2nd, along with my father Robin Jones, who spoke about the history of our shared fellowship here in the US, but with a focus of what happened in the UK and Europe, most of us are aware that Dad, my father, passed suddenly on May 21st of this year. Due to the various local requirements and the ability for my sister and I to be available, living in the US and my father living in the UK, we finally had a private and small burial service which was held on Friday, July the 19th. And Dad was laid to rest next to my mother, who was buried some almost 5 years ago at the same location in St. Albans, near to Bricket Wood, which is just north of London. My father was known well to most of the congregation here and to many thousands of people around the world. As his son and part of the congregation here, being connected to our shared fellowship internationally, I thought it would be fitting that I provide to you all some of the history of Robin Jones and also share some of his key maxims that are based on the Bible and his belief, not only for himself, but for all of those that he served. His connection to our shared fellowship goes back over 70 years. And in that time, he built a foundation of biblical understanding that was truly based on a better world and, of course, the coming kingdom of God. For those of you that appreciate message titles, I have the following for you. Reflections of the Life of Robin George Jones, 1935 to 2024. A Physical Connection to a Spiritual World. To go along with that is my key scripture. We're going to turn to Hebrews 11, verse 13. This set of scriptures is often called the heavenly hope. Looking down here in verse 13 of Hebrews 11, these all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, and they were assured of them, and they embraced them and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on this earth. It is impossible to capture a lifetime of memories and thoughts in the time that we have here today. Robin Jones, like most of you, had a myriad of experiences and interactions with many people. For him, thousands of people in the UK and also internationally, which, of course, has been evidenced by the incredible outpouring of tributes, accolades, and condolences from many from around the world. Perhaps those of you that are here today will all have your own experiences and memories of Robin That, of course, cannot be duplicated. Reading those many tributes that my sister and I received has been a moving but also heartwarming experience. It would not be possible to include the many comments today due to the volume. However, I am going to include one. Many of you know Dr. Timothy Finley, who has been a professor at Azusa Pacific University in Azusa, which is where he got his master's degree. And he's also a fellow graduate of mine from Ambassador, and that was in 1990. We were in the same graduating class. He is the son of the late David and Jean Finley, and the nephew of the late Dr. David Wainwright. Tim, as he is known to most of us, has been a lifelong friend to the Jones family. His father gave my mother away at my parents' wedding in 1961, and his uncle David Wainwright, was one of my father's closest friends until his passing a few years ago. I will now read the message from Dr. Timothy Finley. Robin Jones was a devout Christian, a loving husband, a father, a hard-working and dedicated pastor, an entertaining and instructive preacher and speaker, a lifetime learner, a good friend, and a good man. For over 20 years, my family lived less than a mile away from the Jones family in Bricket Wood. Cherie, that's Tim's sister, and I were in primary school together with Rolf and Danielle. That's my sister. We grew up with them, and we can testify to their father's love for them and their love for their father. Robin Jones was also one of my favorite preachers. He was clear and very entertaining, especially when he went on a sidetrack, which was often. You usually learned something, and the sermons were practical. I saw firsthand in the Mahatma Gandhi Hall in London how effective and loved Mr. Jones was as the pastor of the London church. He was a superb administrator at the Feast of Tabernacles, and I have fond memories from Camber Sands in the UK to Jerusalem, Israel in 2023. He was a man of strong convictions. He did not change his views because it was convenient, but he also helped to develop the talents of other people. I was one of the several that he gave unexpected sermon and Bible study opportunities. He helped Cherie and me on numerous occasions, and he later helped my wife, Eileen, to feel comfortable and welcome in a different church family. And he was enormously good company, and I shall miss him greatly. It is hard to express better words than have just been read, and I will not attempt to do so. However, I will share some of the history of my father along with some of my own memories today. Robin Jones, or just plain Dad for me and for my sister, was a man that always appeared to be larger than life. So a continued insight into his life and history would probably be appropriate. Dad was born in 1935, the second child of George and Florence Jones, becoming a sibling to his older sister Sylvia. Those pre-World War II years had been a struggle for the family, really at the same time as the Great Depression. George, Dad's father, had been able to procure a good job in Epsom, Surrey, which is to the southwest of London, as a chief fireman and safety officer at St. Evers Hospital, Surrey. The job came with a house at the entrance to the grounds, and this provided a stable foundation for both Robin and Sylvia. George, his father, continued in this role until 1967 and his retirement. This location and the Second World War that started in 1939 became the backdrop to Robin's early life. The war finished in 1945, and Dad was almost 10 at that time. War, as you know, makes people grow up very quickly, as they are thrust into all that entails, especially one that lasted 6 years. During that time, Robin and his sister Sylvia were evacuated to areas in the UK to avoid the continual and constant bombing of London. These memories of the war and the evacuation for him to distant family relatives in the Peak District in England, it was these vivid memories for Dad that were the backdrop to much of his life and the incredible accounts that he would share with my sister and me at a very young age. In the early evenings after teaching at Ambassador, where he'd also been a student, Dad would come home and he would put Danielle and me to sleep. But before that, in Technicolor, it was then that Dad became alive. He told us stories recounting all of those experiences, which are all very exciting to our young minds. There were so many different ones that Dad shared, and it seemed that even though we were tucked up in our beds, tight, we were actually there, sharing in those wartime stories. We would ask questions about the elements of the story, and we were provided even more insight and subsequent excitement. Whether it was the memories of going down into air raid shelters each night in London as the aerial dogfights took place across the skies, or farming life in Derbyshire with a large extended family of about 20 or so, the history was alive and exciting. This approach extended to every area of Robin's life. As he became interested and subsequently convicted in his belief in God, first of all, as a teenager in the early 1950s, in 1953, he was introduced by a close school friend to a broadcast on a powerful radio station named Radio Luxembourg. He listened first to the top 40, and then around 11 p.m. came the voice of a man that may be familiar to many of you, Herbert W. Armstrong, bringing you the good news of the world tomorrow. While Dad had heard many religious broadcasts, he had not heard anything quite like the message on the World Tomorrow program. Despite some of the atmospheric listening challenges of those times, Dad would continue to listen to the program, and he wrote off for some of the free literature, which most of you know was free of charge, gratis. Articles by Herbert W. Armstrong, Herman Hay, and others came to mind, and they were shipped and sent to his home. In 1954, Herbert W. Armstrong decided to have a series of in-person campaigns in the UK that would include London, Manchester, Belfast, and Glasgow. The closest one to where my father was working at the time, doing work of national importance, as he chose not to take part in the military, was the Manchester location. And it was at that campaign he was to meet Herbert W. Armstrong, his wife Loma, Dick Armstrong, and a certain doctor who became Dr. Roderick C. Meredith. It was also at this campaign, unbeknownst to my father at the time, that a lady by the name of Edna Palin the next day baptized in a canal near the city of Crewe, and was the first to be a part of our shared fellowship in Europe. In the sermon that was given on March the 2nd, my father gave much more insight and backdrop to this very story. My father Robin continued to be connected with our fellowship, and in 1957 attended a month-long in-person series of lectures by Roderick C. Meredith, who was in the UK to complete his doctoral thesis on the Protestant Reformation. It was on the strength of these month-long lectures that he, along with James Wells, who's still alive in the Midwest, decided to commit to a new way of life and joined a small fledgling group of believers in London each Sabbath and the subsequent holy days in early 1957. My father at the time was studying to be a teacher at Marjohn's College in Chelsea, an area of London. He also saw the need to follow the biblical principle of baptism, which he did in June of 1957 by the laying on of hands, and from a name known to many of us, Gerald Waterhouse. Dad was number 17 of the baptized members in the London church. It was during that year, attending in London, that he saw the need, and encouraged by the ministry, to attend Ambassador College, which at the time had only one location, which was in Pasadena, California, not too far from where we meet today. Dad applied and was accepted to be a student for the autumn of 1958. Now, being accepted was just the start as the fare to travel to Ambassador, which was some many thousands of miles away, was no small undertaking. However, by working hard, he was able to get a fare on a Dutch ship called the Willem Reis, which would take him from Southampton in the UK to North America via the St. Lawrence Seaway and first to Toronto and then onwards to Chicago. He was to take a Greyhound bus from Chicago across the rest of the USA to Pasadena, California. But it was there in Chicago that due to misfortune, he lost his wallet, or it was stolen, which included his money and his tickets. However, he did have the phone number of a certain Dean Blackwell and called him for help. It was there in July he met up with the Blackwell family and also to meet the future Pastor General Joseph Tkach Sr. and other brethren in the Chicago area. The Blackwell family took him down to Big Sandy, Texas, and from there he was able to get a ride share with Ray Shelton and two other students heading out to Pasadena. Out of adversity, God gave my father other experiences that were to shape and mold his continued experiences. When Dad finally got to the campus in Pasadena, he had just one thin dime in his pocket. But he was able to get employment initially on the grounds crew. During his freshman year at Ambassador, with the recommendation of another name that might be familiar to you all, Dr. David Antian, who I understand is still with us and spoke at the recent Ambassador reunion just a few weeks ago, he was chosen as freshman class president and started to learn about leadership under the guise of Ambassador and a new way of life. The fellowship was growing, and in 1959, what was to become the second Ambassador campus was purchased in Bricket Wood, England. To have a college, there needs to be students. So Dad, along with a few others, some of the names were David Wainwright, Gerhard Marx, Con Catherwood, Guy Engelbart, Ruth Myrick, and James Wells, were sent to Bricket Wood to be upperclassmen, along with some of the faculty members, including the now late Dr. Benjamin Ray, who was the first principal, and also other recent graduates, including a certain Shirley Engelbart, who was to start the new college library from scratch. Mr. Armstrong insisted that the student body president be English, and as there were no English seniors in 1960-61, so as a junior, my father was chosen for the role. And then he was also chosen for that role as a senior in 1961 to 62. I am not sure in the history of Ambassador, and certainly not in the UK, where a person was chosen for the role 2 years in a row. However, that was the case. And during the early part of 1961 and the first semester of my father's senior year, Dad became serious with a college librarian and faculty member, Shirley Engelbart. They married on December the 27th, 1961. My mother remembered for many years how cold the weather was that year, including the short honeymoon that they had together to Bristol, England, and the West Country. Dad graduated from Ambassador in May of 1962. I was employed by the work, as it was known, in the visiting program. My mother continued to work an Ambassador as a faculty member until the end of 1963. It was in May of 1963 that my father was ordained. I shall quote directly from my father's recollections upon sharing with him the passing of Ben Chapman several years ago. I quote now, "We were ordained at the same time at the Friday night Bible study, 25th of May, 1963, in the campus music hall. Mr. Armstrong officiated. David Wainwright, Leon Walker, Ben Chapman, and me. It's all quite clear in my memory. When we zoom fast forward to the present, only Leon Walker remains alive with us. All were ordained to the rank of preaching elder, with the exception of Leon Walker, who was ordained as a local elder. However, subsequently he was raised to the rank of evangelist, which I believe he still has that designation now. Dad and Mum were sent to minister to the brethren and potential members, first in the north of England and then Scotland, starting the very first group in Glasgow in 1964. I was born in May of 1965, and not long after my birth, they received a phone call from Herbert W. Armstrong himself, asking my father, would he like to come back down to Bricket Wood and teach at the college? My mother was especially keen, as she was an educator at heart and was very happy to have the call to come back to work and teach at the college. Now, this move back to Bricket Wood did not negate my father's ministerial duties, as he was still a pastor and he would continue to pastor congregations while teaching at Ambassador. Some of these congregations were, first of all, Leeds and Warrington in the north of England, some 3 hours plus drive one way up the M1 or M6 each Sabbath morning, returning often in the small hours of Sunday morning. During this time, my sister was born in 1968, and my mother almost died in the weeks and months following her birth. My father set an example of fasting for over a week to ask for God's mercy and intervention in keeping mother alive. His prayers were answered. And while my mother's health was never very good during much of her adult life, God granted her 82 years and some 58 with my father. Between 1965 and 1974, Dad was teaching at the Ambassador campus in Bricket Wood. He was initially brought on to teach journalism, creative writing, and speech. He also became the faculty advisor for the college publication, The Portfolio, which had previously been overseen by Mr. Robert Borica. However, as time progressed, his teaching responsibilities increased, and by 1974 he was teaching comparative religion and also fourth-year Bible for the senior class. When the college closed, Dad and Mum were pushed back into, or sent back into the ministry full-time, being assigned first to a few weeks in the Luton congregation, just north of the Bricket Wood area, but then for a longer period in Nottingham and starting a church in Northampton. When Dr. David Wainwright and family returned to the USA in the following year, 1976, he was going to teach in Big Sandy. So he recommended that my father take over the congregation, or what's called the North London congregation. We were all very happy about that because that enabled us to return to our home in Bricket Wood, and of course the London church is only 20 plus miles away from our home. My father and mother, they served in the London congregation from 1976 to 1985, which at the time was the largest congregation in the country and was for many years. One event sticks out in my mind during that time. In 1982, with a visit of Herbert W. Armstrong speaking to the old Bricket Wood congregation, my father, along with Paul Suckling, were reordained to the rank of pastor from preaching elder by Mr. Armstrong himself, along with Frank Brown, who was the regional director at the time. While I was not around for the first ordination, I was for the second, and it's one that is etched in my mind. I was 17 at the time. During that period that my parents were in London, I went to Ambassador College in 1983, initially to Big Sandy, and then subsequently to Pasadena. In 1985, the family were transferred to a new church area after being 9 years in London to a southwest of the country. They covered the areas of Reading, Godalming, and Southampton. After serving in that area for about 10 years, in 1995, my father and mother were transferred back to London for a further 5 years. So they got their full of the London area. I will add that my father was born in Brixton, which is in South London, so perhaps God thought it was fitting that he would serve in an area that he knew much about. In 2000, the year 2000, Mum and Dad were technically retired. But really, his ministry went from being pastoral for one particular area to being a guest speaker all over the United Kingdom and many areas, and from time to time in the United States. Both of my parents worked tirelessly for the needs of the brethren that they served, which often increased by the advent of modern technology, advances such as email, where questions were not only answered by telephone or in person, but by response emails. And these advances of the internet and the World Wide Web added often much more work for those that in the ministry. In August of 2019, my mother Shirley passed. And along with that was Dad's technology expert with all the computer skills related. However, he continued to soldier on using various screens and pads, painstakingly responding to questions from the brethren and emails, one letter at a time. And I mean letter as in A, B, C, D, poked out by his finger and thumb. As you know, he did this and was very active until his passing in May of this year. Over his lifetime, Robin gave thousands of messages. All of them had accounts and stories of human interest. He understood how to capture people's attention. It must be captivating, it must be interesting, and then, maybe just then, people will listen and perhaps implement the value of the message in their own lives. Many of you here today will understand this approach. While my father was a man of faith for the majority of his life, in public, he never presented himself as what many in the world would perceive as a religious man, or someone who was sanctimonious. Having spent numerous hours with my father, it did not matter to whom he was speaking or talking to, which were many. He presented himself as a regular person with interest in every walk of life. If one were to look at the voluminous library of books that both my mother and father maintained, as my sister and I have been going through in recent times, it is very clear that learning and knowledge was critical in his walk in life. Understanding and correct knowledge was the key. It did not matter to Robin what station you were in life. The mantra that he shared to me on multiple occasions was that we should respect all human beings as children of God. This Robin did and set a great example of such and how that we should interact with our fellow human beings. He would often say to me, how can we really help others if we do not understand them or the troubles that they are going through? On a personal level, Dad was always exciting and a joy to be with. From my earliest memories, spending time with Dad was special. I remember so many family excursions at a young age, many with just my sister and me. It did not seem to matter so much what the activity was, but being with this man, this person that was so energetic, full of life, but he was also our father. From fun fairs, walks in the park or the forest, sporting events at school, professional football, seeing my favorite Spurs win trophies, and also the national team in Euros or World Cup, to having meals together. The list was endless. Never a dull moment, as they say. There were trips that we took together, including ones to many areas of the United States, Europe, and an adventure in 1990 where we traveled from London to Istanbul and back by car. Dad loved his family and along with Mum sacrificed for them financially and with their time, providing comfort during those troubled times that affect us all. Now, I would be remiss in saying throughout it all, Dad always encouraged the family to stay close to God so that we may have a way out in a very mixed up and troubled world. It was a set of values and beliefs that were his rock and moral compass, and one that he shared in the way that he acted and he lived and led his life. Both my sister and I, Danielle, were very, very fortunate to have Dad come and visit with us both this year in the United States for an extended period. He was here in the US from December to March, both in Texas and also here in California. Now, neither of us realized at that time that his passing would come so quickly after this trip. Both of the families were able to spend a good amount of time with him and enjoyed his company on a daily basis, which was treasured time. I know especially that he enjoyed spending time with his 3 grandchildren and all of their interests, their homework, and their activities. One very special memory for me was able to give a message with my father on the Sabbath right here on March 2nd. Most of you were here for those messages. My focus was on the kingdom of God that is yet to come, and his was on the history of our shared fellowship. It's an honor that I shall not forget. To provide not just a historical account, but one that has a biblical message and legacy for the beliefs that Robin Jones held so dearly, I have picked 3 key areas that were close to my father and the manner in which he led his life. Now, the first of these 3 is stay close to God. I repeat that, stay close to God. This can be backed up by scriptural references. The first that I wish to turn to is in Psalm 73. 73 verse 28. But it is good for me to draw near to God. I have put my trust in the Lord God, that I may declare all your works. The next one, echoing being close to God here, would be found in Joshua 1 verse 9. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and of good courage. Do not be afraid, nor be dismayed. For the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. So point 1 was stay close to God. We move to point 2. It is God who gives titles, positions, and responsibilities. I'll preface this with a small and personal anecdote. A number of years ago, I was working at a particular company, and I'd been there for a while, and I thought I was doing quite well, but I didn't feel I was necessarily being recognized in the way that I should. I thought, well, I know all of this well, and I'm working hard, and I think I should get a promotion. And my father, he listened, and he said, well, son, he says, promotion really only comes from God. And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, he said, let's look at the biblical principle and example. We'll go to Psalm 75, verse 6 and 7. For exaltation, and in the King James, which I prefer, it says promotion, comes neither from the east, nor the west, nor from the south. Verse 7, but God is the judge. He puts down one and he exalts another. But God is the judge. He puts down one and exalts another. The key here is it is God who promotes and puts people into the positions that he feels that they should be. The second verse in this area would be James 4, verse 10. Humble yourself in the sight of the Lord, and he will lift you up. The third of the 3 areas is that of respecting all human beings. Respect all human beings. 1 Peter 2, verse 17. In verse 17 it says, honor all people, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king. If you see here, you've got quite the spread here. Doesn't just focus on one, doesn't even just focus on God. It focuses on the whole gamut of what we are to do in respecting people and other beings. Romans 12, verse 10, dropping down to verse 10, be kindly affectionate to one another. So be kindly and affectionate to one another with brotherly love, in honor, giving preference to one another, thinking about someone else, not just ourselves. Also in the New Testament is Philippians 2, verse 3. Verse 3, let nothing be done through selfish ambition or conceit, but in lowliness of mind, let each esteem others better than himself. These scriptures that we have read today, and many more, were the foundation of the backdrop of what my father believed and how he led his life. But it was not only his belief, but it is also his legacy. So with Dad's sudden passing on a May spring day in the house where he spent so many years living in, his larger-than-life physical being left us. As it states in Ecclesiastes 12, verse 7, written by the wisdom of King Solomon, Ecclesiastes 12, verse 7, then shall the dust return to the earth as it was, and the spirit shall return unto God who gave it. It is my sister Danielle's and my shared belief that our Father sleeps, awaiting the time of the resurrection, when at that time his spirit will be returned to him. But it won't be in a physical manner, it will be in an incorruptible manner. And then Robin Jones will indeed be larger than life for eternity. He will then receive the promises along with all of those that sleep, having seen them afar off. Until that day for him, and until that day for you and me, as is stated in the book of Job, we shall await our time of change.
We thank you, our listeners, for joining us here today for the Kubik Report. If you have enjoyed this podcast, please share it and tell your friends about it. We can be found on a variety of platforms, including Podbean, which includes information about this podcast, Apple and Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Amazon Music, Audible, Pocket Caster, and other podcasting platforms. You can easily find us on any browser address bar by simply typing in the words, The Kubik Report, and there we are. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to hear your impressions and suggestions. So write to us at vkubik@gmail.com, vkubik@gmail.com. Again, thank you for listening. Come back soon for more.